It was one of those nights when the rain didn't just fall, it poured relentlessly, turning the streets into rivers and the fields into vast lakes of muddy water. The town had been warned about the incoming storm, but no one had expected it to be this bad. Among the chaos, a young boy named Jamal sat by the window of his modest home, watching the rain lash against the glass. At just 14 years old, Jamal had already learned to shoulder more responsibility than most kids his age. His mother worked long shifts at the local diner, leaving him to take care of his younger sister, Amara, after school. But tonight, as the storm raged on, something in the air felt different. Dangerous. Jamal's instincts kicked in when he heard a faint cry for help over the sound of the downpour. At first, he thought it might be the wind playing tricks, but then he heard it again. Clearer this time. A desperate shout, coming from somewhere beyond the row of houses near the creek. "Stay here," Jamal told Amara, who was clutching her stuffed bear tightly. "Don't open the door for anyone, okay? I'll be back soon." He grabbed a flashlight and his old raincoat, which was more patches than fabric, and bolted out into the night. The wind was fierce, slamming into him with every step, but Jamal pushed forward, his heart pounding as the cries grew louder. When he reached the edge of the creek, his breath caught in his throat. The usually calm stream had turned into a ferocious torrent, the water rushing so fast it seemed alive. And there, clinging to a fallen tree in the middle of the raging flood, was an elderly man. His face was pale with terror, his hands gripping the slippery bark as the water threatened to sweep him away at any moment. "Hang on," Jamal shouted, his voice barely carrying over the roaring water. He didn't stop to think. There wasn't time for that. He found a sturdy branch and waded into the freezing water, his legs trembling as the current pushed against him. Step by step, he inched closer to the man, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the scene. The man's eyes met Jamal's, wide with fear, but also a glimmer of hope. I can't hold on much longer." He gasped, his voice weak. "You're not going anywhere," Jamal shouted back, though his own fear was creeping in. He extended the branch toward the man, who reached out with trembling hands. For a moment, it seemed like the current would win, pulling them both into its icy grip. But with one final effort, Jamal managed to haul the man to safety. They collapsed on the muddy bank, both soaked and shivering but alive. "Thank you. Thank you, son," the man stammered, his voice shaking as much as his body. Jamal nodded, too out of breath to respond, but the relief in his chest was overwhelming. By the time Jamal got home, his clothes were drenched, and his muscles ached from the effort. He didn't tell Amara what had happened. She'd been through enough just worrying about the storm. He simply tucked her into bed and promised that everything would be okay. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds as if nothing had happened, casting a golden light over the waterlogged streets. Jamal was eating a bowl of cereal when he heard the unmistakable rumble of a car engine. It wasn't just any car. It was sleek and black, its windows tinted so dark that it seemed to absorb the sunlight. It stopped right in front of Jamal's house, and his heart skipped a beat. "Jamal." Amara called from the living room, peeking through the curtains. "There's a car outside. Who is it?" "I don't know," Jamal replied, setting his spoon down. He felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease as he walked to the door. What could this mean? Had the man told someone about what happened? As he reached for the doorknob, 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Why would a car like that be here? What did they want? He opened the door slowly, the sunlight streaming into the room as he squinted to see who was inside the mysterious vehicle. And then, Jamal stood frozen at the door for a moment, his hand gripping the frame as he stared at the sleek black car. The engine purred softly, an almost menacing sound in the quiet morning. He squinted, trying to see through the tinted windows, but they were impenetrable. For a brief moment, he considered closing the door and pretending no one was home. But curiosity ignored him, and before he could stop himself, he stepped outside, letting the screen door slam shut behind him. The car door opened with a faint click, and a tall man stepped out. He was dressed in a crisp black suit, his shoes polished to a shine that reflected the morning light. His face was sharp and unreadable, the kind of face that gave nothing away. He glanced at Jamal, then at the small weathered house, before nodding slightly as if confirming he was in the right place. "Jamal, is it?" the man asked, his voice deep and calm, yet carrying an air of authority. Jamal hesitated, his instincts telling him to be cautious. "Yeah, that's me," he replied, his voice quieter than he intended. The man's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I believe you had an eventful night," he said, his tone polite but pointed. "May I come in?" Jamal's heart raced. How did this man know about last night? Had the elderly man told him? And if so, why? His mind scrambled for answers. But he nodded slowly, stepping aside to let the man in. Inside, the house felt even smaller with the man standing in the living room, his presence filling the space. Amara peeked out from the hallway, clutching her bear, her wide eyes fixed on the stranger. Jamal shot her a reassuring look, though he wasn't sure he felt reassured himself. The man didn't sit down. Instead, he stood near the worn sofa, his hands clasped in front of him as he looked around. "You have a nice home," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't here to make small talk. He turned his gaze back to Jamal. "I'm here because of what you did last night. You saved a man's life." Jamal swallowed hard. "Yeah, but how do you know about that?" "Who are you?" The man reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a sleek black wallet, flipping it open to reveal a badge. "My name is Mr. Carter. I work for an organization that deals with, let's say, unique situations. The man you saved, he's someone very important." "Important?" Jamal repeated, his brow furrowing. He didn't look important. He just looked scared. Mr. Carter's lips twitched into that faint smile again. Appearances can be deceiving. What matters is that you acted without hesitation. You risked your own safety to help a stranger. That's rare these days, especially in someone so young. Jamal wasn't sure how to respond. He didn't feel like a hero. He had just done what felt right. But the way Mr. Carter was looking at him made it seem like there was more to this than a simple thank you. "So, what do you want?" Jamal asked cautiously. Mr. Carter's expression grew more serious. "I can't go into details here, but let's just say the man you saved is grateful. Very grateful. He'd like to thank you personally." Jamal blinked in surprise. "Thank me. But who is he?" Mr. Carter hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "All I can tell you right now is that his name is Mr. Kingsley. Well, let's just say he has connections that most people can only dream of. He doesn't forget acts of kindness, and he always repays his debts." Jamal felt a strange mix of emotions, pride, curiosity, and a flicker of unease. "I wasn't expecting anything. I just did what I thought anyone would do." "Not everyone would have done what you did," Mr. Carter said firmly. "That's why you're here, and that's why he sent me." Jamal glanced at Amara, who was still peeking around the corner. He didn't want to leave her alone, especially after the chaos of the storm. "If he wants to thank me, can't he just come here?" Mr. Carter's smile returned, but it was tinged with something Jamal couldn't quite place. "Mr. Kingsley values privacy. He prefers to meet you in a setting where he can express his gratitude properly." Something about the way he said it made Jamal's stomach tighten. This wasn't just about thank you. There was something deeper going on, something Mr. Carter wasn't telling him. "I don't know," Jamal said slowly. "I've got responsibilities here, my sister." "Amara will be safe," Mr. Carter interrupted smoothly, glancing at the little girl. "In fact, we can arrange for someone to stay here while we're gone. He won't be away for long." Jamal hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't know this man, and he certainly didn't know Mr. Kingsley. But there was something compelling about the way Mr. Carter spoke, as if saying no wasn't really an option. Before he could make a decision, Mr. Carter reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small envelope. "Take your time to think it over," he said, handing it to Jamal. "Inside, you'll find all the information you need, as well as a small token of Mr. Kingsley's appreciation." Jamal opened the envelope cautiously. Inside was a thick wad of cash, more money than he had ever seen in his life. His eyes widened, and he looked up at Mr. Carter in disbelief. "This is just the beginning," Mr. Carter said, his voice low and deliberate. "If you choose to meet Mr. Kingsley, there could be much more where that came from. But the choice is yours." With that, Mr. Carter turned and walked back to the car, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He didn't look back as he got in and drove away, leaving Jermel standing on the porch, the envelope in his hand and a storm of questions swirling in his mind. As the car disappeared down the street, Jermel felt the weight of the moment settle over him. What had he gotten himself into? And who exactly was Mr. Kingsley? He didn't have answers yet, but one thing was clear. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Jermel sat on the porch long after the black car had disappeared, the envelope of cash resting in his lap like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. The early morning air, damp and cooled from the storm, clung to him as he stared out at the street, his thoughts tangled in knots. What did this mean? Who was this Mr. Kingsley, and why did he care so much about what Jamal had done? It was just one moment, one decision, but it seemed to have set off a chain of events he couldn't understand. Amara crept out onto the porch, a small figure framed by the light from the doorway. "Jamal, who was that man?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jamal looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of protecting her from whatever this was. "Just someone saying thanks," he said, trying to sound casual. "Nothing to worry about." Her big brown eyes searched his face for a moment before she nodded and sat down beside him, leaning her head against his arm. "Are you going to go?" she asked quietly. Jamal didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the envelope again, the crisp bills inside representing more money than his family had seen in years. The thought of what it could do for them was tempting. Fixing the leaky roof, paying off his mom's overdue bills, maybe even saving for Amara's future. But the uneasy feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. That night Jamal lay awake in his bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. His mind replayed the events of the flood, the man's desperate face, the icy grip of the water, the overwhelming relief when they'd made it to safety. He didn't regret what he'd done, but now he was caught in something much bigger than he'd bargained for. As much as he wanted to ignore it, he knew that Mr. Carter and this mysterious Mr. Kingsley wouldn't just forget about him. They'd come back, and they'd expect an answer. The next morning, Jamal made his way to the diner where his mom worked, hoping to find some clarity. She was bustling between tables when he arrived, her tired smile brightening at sight of him. "Hey, baby," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you here so early?" Jamal hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. "Just wanted to see you," he said, sitting at the counter. "You doing okay?" She nodded, though the lines of exhaustion on her face told a different story. "Busy as always," she said with a sigh. "But we're getting by." Jamal's gaze dropped to the counter, the envelope of cash burning a hole in his backpack. He thought about showing it to her, about asking for her advice, but something held him back. If he told her everything, she'd worry. Or worse, she'd try to take control of the situation, and he couldn't risk dragging her into whatever this was. On his way home, Jamal decided to take the long route through town, hoping the walk would help him clear his head. As he passed the old hardware store, a man sitting on a bench caught his eye. He was older, his face weathered but kind, and he gave Jamal a nod of recognition. "You're the boy who saved Mr. Kingsley," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Jamal stopped in his tracks, his pulse quickening. "How do you know about that?" The man chuckled, leaning back on the bench. "Word gets around, especially when it's about someone like him." Jamal frowned, his curiosity piqued despite his caution. "Who is he? Everyone keeps saying he's important, but no one tells me why." The man's smile faded, and he looked at Jamal with a seriousness that sent a chill down his spine. "Mr. Kingsley is not someone you cross. Let's just say he's got power in places most people don't even know exist. If he's taken an interest in you, boy, you best tread carefully." Jamal's stomach turned. Why would someone like that care about me? I just helped him out of the water." The man shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Maybe he sees something in you. Or maybe he thinks he owes you. Either way, you're on his radar now." Jamal walked away from the conversation feeling no closer to answers, only more questions. Who was Mr. Kingsley really? And what did he want from Jamal? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about gratitude. It was about something bigger, something he didn't yet understand. Back at home, Jamal opened the envelope again, staring at the money. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If he accepted Mr. Kingsley's invitation, he might find out the truth, but he also knew that stepping into that world could change everything, and not necessarily for the better. That night, as he sat at the kitchen table, Jamal's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. His heart leaped into his throat as he got up and peeked through the window. Outside, standing in the dim glow of the porch light, was a woman he didn't recognize. She was dressed in a simple coat, her hair pulled back into a neat bun, and she held a small package in her hands. Jamal opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Kingsley asked me to deliver this to you," she said, holding out the package. Jamal hesitated before taking it, his hands trembling slightly. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll find out," she said simply. "But remember, Jamal, he's giving you a chance. Don't waste it." Before he could ask her anything else, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as she had appeared. Jamal closed the door and placed the package on the table, staring at it like it might explode. Slowly, he unwrapped the paper, revealing a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside was a sleek black card with his name embossed in gold letters and a single word beneath it: asterisk reserved asterisk. There was also a note written in elegant handwriting: asterisk your journey begins soon. Be ready asterisk. Jamal's hands shook as he read the note, his mind racing. What journey? What did they mean? He felt like he was being pulled into a game he didn't understand, with rules that weren't clear. And yet, a part of him couldn't help but wonder, what if this was an opportunity? What if it was a chance to change everything for himself and his family? As he sat there in the quiet kitchen, the weight of the decision settled over him. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: there was no going back now. The next few days passed in a haze of uncertainty for Jamal. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life was teetering on the edge of something huge, something he wasn't ready for. The black card sat on his nightstand, its golden letters glinting in the light. No one else had come by, no more mysterious visits or cryptic messages, but the tension lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on him. He tried to distract himself with the usual routine, getting Amara to school, helping his mom with errands, and hanging out at the local basketball court with his friends. But no matter what he did, his mind kept drifting back to Mr. Kingsley and the note. Your journey begins soon. What did it mean? What journey? Every time he thought about it, his chest tightened, a mix of fear and reluctant curiosity. It was late one evening when the silence broke. Jamal was in his room, trying to focus on his homework, when he heard a strange sound outside. It was faint at first, like a low hum, but it grew louder, vibrating through the walls. He froze, his pencil slipping from his fingers. The sound was unlike anything he'd heard before, mechanical but almost alive. Slowly, he made his way to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. Pulling back the curtain, he saw it. A sleek, black helicopter hovering just above the empty lot behind his house. Its blades sliced through the air, kicking up dust and debris, and the symbol on its side was one he didn't recognize but felt was important. Before he could react, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He grabbed it, his hands trembling, and saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. Against his better judgment, he answered. Jamal, the voice said, deep and calm. It was Mr. Carter. Your ride is here. It's time. Time for what? Jamal asked, his voice cracking. I didn't say yes. I never agreed to anything. You didn't have to, Mr. Carter replied smoothly. This isn't the kind of offer you turn down. Mr. Kingsley is expecting you, and trust me, you don't want to disappoint him. Jamal felt a cold knot in his stomach. He wanted to argue, to say no, but the words wouldn't come. Something about Mr. Carter's tone told him this wasn't a choice. It was an order. "What about my sister?" he asked, glancing toward Amara's room. "I can't just leave her." "She'll be taken care of," Mr. Carter said. "We've arranged for someone to stay with her while we're gone. She'll be safe." Jamal didn't like the sound of that, but before he could protest, Mr. Carter added, "Don't keep us waiting, Jamal. The clock is ticking." The call ended, leaving Jamal standing there, the phone still pressed to his ear. He looked out at the helicopter again, its presence surreal against the backdrop of his quiet neighborhood. His gut told him to run, to hide, to protect himself and Amara. But another part of him, the part that had opened that box, that had held that black card in its hands, knew there was no running from this. He grabbed his backpack, stuffing it with a few essentials, and scribbled a quick note for Amara. He didn't know how to explain what was happening, so he kept it simple. Asterisk, "I'll be back soon. Don't worry, love you, asterisk." As he stepped outside, the wind from the helicopter's blades whipped around him, stinging his face. A man in a black suit stood waiting by the open door, his expression unreadable. Jamal hesitated, his legs feeling like lead, but the man beckoned him forward with a slight nod. The moment he climbed inside, the noise of the world outside disappeared, replaced by the low hum of the helicopter's engine. The interior was sleek and intimidating, with leather seats and glowing panels that looked like they belonged in a sci-fi movie. Mr. Carter sat across from him, his sharp eyes studying Jamal like a hawk sizing up its prey. "Good," Mr. Carter said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've made the right decision." Jamal didn't respond. His mind was spinning, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack, so tightly his knuckles turned white. He watched as the ground fell away beneath them, his neighborhood shrinking into a patchwork of rooftops and streets. The reality of what was happening hit him like a wave. He was leaving everything he knew behind, heading into the unknown with a man he didn't trust and a promise he didn't understand. The flight was silent except for the hum of the engine. Jamal tried to stay calm, but every passing minute only added to the tension building inside him. Where were they going? What was waiting for him? He glanced at Mr. Carter, hoping for some kind of explanation, but the man's expression gave nothing away. After what felt like hours, the helicopter began to descend, the lights of a city sprawling out below them. But this wasn't any city Jamal recognized. The buildings were sleek and modern, their glass facades reflecting the glow of neon signs and towering billboards. It was like stepping into another world, one that felt both dazzling and unsettling. The helicopter landed on a rooftop, and Jamal followed Mr. Carter out into the night air. A group of men in suits was waiting for them, their faces obscured by the shadows. One of them stepped forward, his posture straight and commanding. "Mr. Kingsley is ready to see you," the man said, his voice cold and precise. Jamal's stomach churned. He wanted to turn around, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of their gazes on him, the unspoken expectation that he would follow. And so, with no other choice, he did. They led him through a series of corridors, each one more elaborate than the last. The walls were lined with artwork that looked priceless, and the floors gleamed under the soft light of chandeliers. Jamal felt out of place, his sneakers squeaking against the polished marble. But he kept moving forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, they stopped in front of a massive set of double doors. The man who had spoken earlier turned to Jamal, his expression unreadable. "Good luck," he said, before pushing the doors open. Jamal stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. The room was vast, its high ceilings stretching into darkness, and at the far end was a figure seated behind a large, ornate desk. The man was older, his silver hair neatly combed, and his piercing eyes locked onto Jamal the moment he entered. "Welcome," Mr. Kingsley said, his voice smooth and commanding. "We have much to discuss." Jamal felt a shiver run down his spine. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and anticipating all at once. And as he stood there, the weight of everything that had led to this point pressing down on him, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Jermel stood frozen, the air in the grand room thick with tension. Mr. Kingsley leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze studying Jamal with an intensity that made his palms sweat. For a moment there was silence, save for the faint ticking of an ornate clock on the wall. Jermel's thoughts raced, questions swirling in his mind. Why was he here? What could a man like this possibly want from him? Do you know why you're here, Jamal? Mr. Kingsley finally asked, his voice calm but weighted with authority. Jamal swallowed hard, shaking his head. No, sir, he said quietly, his voice barely audible. Mr. Kingsley chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down Jamal's spine. Honesty. I respect that, he said. He gestured to the seat across from him. Please sit. We have a lot to discuss. Jamal hesitated before moving forward, his legs feeling like lead. He sank into the plush leather chair, his fingers gripping the armrests as if they might keep him grounded in this surreal moment. Mr. Kingsley leaned forward, steepling his fingers on the desk. You did something remarkable, he began. Most people would have turned away, would have let fear or self-interest guide them. But you? He paused, his sharp eyes locking onto Jamal's. You showed courage, compassion, and those qualities are rare in this world. Jamal didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Mr. Kingsley continued, his tone softening slightly. But you must understand, Jamal, that saving me wasn't just a kind act. It was a catalyst. A ripple in the water that set off a chain reaction. And now, you're a part of something much bigger than yourself. Jamal's heart pounded as he tried to process the words. What do you mean? He managed to ask, his voice shaky. Mr. Kingsley smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. There are forces at play, Jamal, powerful forces that shake the world in ways most people can't even imagine. I'm at the center of those forces, and now so are you. Jamal's chest tightened. He wanted to believe this was some elaborate misunderstanding, but the weight of Mr. Kingsley's words told him otherwise. Before he could ask more, Mr. Kingsley pressed a button on his desk, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a screen. The screen lit up, displaying grainy surveillance footage of the flood. Jamal recognized himself immediately, struggling through the water with the elderly man. But then the footage shifted. It showed the black car pulling up to his house, Mr. Carter's arrival, and even the moment he opened the mysterious package. Jamal's stomach dropped. How did you? He started, but Mr. Kingsley raised a hand, silencing him. We've been watching you, he said simply. Not just since the flood, long before that. Jamal's head spun. Why? What do you want from me? Mr. Kingsley leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You're special, Jamal. You have potential to make a difference. But potential is just that, a possibility. It's up to you to decide how to use it. Jamal opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the doors to the room burst open. A woman strode in, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She was dressed in a sharp suit, her presence commanding attention. Jamal noticed Mr. Kingsley's jaw tighten, his calm demeanor slipping for the first time. Excuse the interruption, she said, her tone sharp. But I believe you're withholding some important details. Leela, Mr. Kingsley said, his voice clipped. This is not your concern. Oh, but it is, she countered, her gaze shifting to Jamal. He deserves to know the whole truth. Jamal's pulse quickened as he looked between the two of them. What truth? He asked, his voice rising. What's going on? Leila turned to him, her expression softening slightly. Jamal, you weren't chosen by chance. The flood wasn't just an accident, it was a test. Jamal's blood ran cold. A test, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. Mr. Kingsley orchestrated it, the entire thing. He wanted to see how you would react, whether you had what it takes to. That's enough, Mr. Kingsley snapped, his voice booming. He stood, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the room. Jamal doesn't need to know every detail. Not yet. Jamal shot to his feet, his hands clenched into fists. You're telling me you put people's lives at risk, my life, just to see what I'd do. That's sick. Mr. Kingsley's expression hardened. You don't understand the stakes, Jamal. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary for the greater good. Jamal shook his head, anger and disbelief swirling inside him. No, that's not right. You can't just play with people's lives like that. Before Mr. Kingsley could respond, Lila stepped closer to Jamal, lowering her voice. You're not the first, Jamal, she said. And you won't be the last. You have a choice. You can walk away, pretend none of this happened. Or you can stay and fight, to make sure no one else gets used the way you were. Jamal's mind raced, his chest heaving. The room felt suffocating, the weight of the decision crushing him. Mr. Kingsley's voice cut through the haze, cold and commanding. Think carefully, Jamal. This isn't just about you. It's about something much bigger. Choose wisely. As the tension in the room reached its breaking point, Jamal realized that his next move could change everything, not just for him, but for everyone caught in Mr. Kingsley's web. Jamal stood frozen, his mind torn between the anger boiling inside him and the weight of the decision hanging over his head. Every fiber of his being screamed to walk away, to escape this tangled mess and go back to his life before the flood. But Leda's words lingered in his mind. Asterisk you have a choice asterisk. Taking a deep breath, Jamal looked straight at Mr. Kingsley, his fists unclenching. I'm staying, he said, his voice steady but firm. Not for you. For the people you've used and the ones you're planning to. Mr. Kingsley's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes betrayed no warmth. A bold decision, he said. But you'll learn, Jamal, that boldness without understanding can be dangerous. Leda placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. You're doing the right thing, she said softly, but there's something you need to see. Without waiting for Mr. Kingsley's approval, Lila led Jamal out of the room and down a series of corridors. The farther they went, the darker and colder the atmosphere became. Finally, they stopped in front of a heavily secured door. Lila punched in a code, and with a mechanical hiss, the door slid open. Inside was a room unlike anything Jamal had ever seen. It was filled with monitors, each one displaying live footage of different locations, streets, homes, even private moments. In the center of the room was a large, glowing map, dotted with hundreds of red markers. This is how he controls everything, Leela explained. Every disaster, every crisis, he monitors it all. And when the opportunity arises, he intervenes, not to help, but to manipulate. Jamal's stomach turned as he looked at the screens. He saw people in distress, their lives unraveling before his eyes, and realized that to Mr. Kingsley, they were nothing more than pawns. This is wrong, he said, his voice shaking. This has to stop. That's why I brought you here, Leela said. You can help us shut it down. Jamal turned to her, confusion and suspicion warring in his mind. Us? Who's us? Before Leela could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. A group of guards appeared, their weapons drawn, and behind them was Mr. Kingsley. His expression was calm, but his eyes were cold as steel. Did you really think I wouldn't know what you were planning, Lila? He said, his voice dripping with contempt. You've always been predictable. Lila stepped in front of Jamal, her body tense. You can't keep this up forever, Kingsley. People are waking up. They're starting to see through your lies. Kingsley laughed, a hollow, menacing sound. And what will you do, Lila? Shut down the system. It won't stop anything. I'm the system. Jamal felt a surge of anger. You're not invincible, he said, stepping forward. People like you always think they're untouchable. But you're just a man, and men can be stopped. Kingsley's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Jamal thought he saw a flicker of doubt. But then Kingsley raised his hand, and the guards advanced. Get him out of here, Kingsley ordered, pointing at Jamal. And as for you, Leila, Your betrayal ends now. Before the guards could reach him, Leela grabbed Jamal's arm and pulled him toward a hidden panel in the wall. She pressed a button, and a small passageway opened. "Go," she shouted. "I'll hold them off." "I'm not leaving you," Jamal protested, but Leela pushed him inside. "Go, Jamal. You're the only one who can expose him." The door closed behind him, and Jamal found himself running through a dimly lit tunnel. His heart pounded as he heard shouts and gunfire echoing behind him. He didn't know where the passage led, but he kept moving, driven by a mixture of fear and determination. Finally, he emerged in a quiet alleyway. The city stretched out before him, its lights skittering in the darkness. He realized he was free, but the fight was far from over. Jamal pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he began recording a message. He spoke about everything he had seen: the surveillance, the manipulation, the disasters orchestrated for power. He didn't know if anyone would believe him, but he had to try. As he uploaded the video, a sleek black car pulled up in front of him. For a moment, his heart stopped, thinking it was Kingsley's men. But the window rolled down, and he saw Leela in the driver's seat, bruised but alive. "You didn't think I'd let you finish this alone, did you?" she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. Jamal climbed into the car, relief washing over him. As they sped off into the night, he couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Kingsley might have been powerful, but he wasn't invincible. Together, they had a chance to bring him down. But as they turned a corner, Jamal noticed a small device blinking under the dashboard. Before he could say anything, a voice crackled through the car's speakers, Kingsley's voice. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" he said, his tone dripping with malice. The car swerved, the screen on the dashboard lighting up with a countdown. Jamal's breath caught as he realized the fight was far from over.